Nyata. Hi everybody, my name's Rueben Berg. I'm a Good Tomorrow man and I'm a member of the First People's Assembly of Victoria. And thanks for joining in on this video here where I'm going to be talking you through one of the documents that's recently been released as part of the First People's Assembly of Victoria, and just really keen to share my perspective on it and invite others out there in the community to provide me with their perspective on this document. And recognizing as I'm starting this video though that it's been a challenging 12 months I think for everybody, so I hope everyone out there is doing okay. And yeah, despite all that kind of craziness going on in the community around the world, I do think it's important that we do continue along this path, along treaty, and there are still some important things to be discussed. And this is one of those things. So I'm just trying out a new method here of trying to engage and reach out and share with people. So I'd be keen to hear what people think of this and just let me know any feedback that you've got. But what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be talking you through a specific document here, which has just been released by the Assembly. And this is around additional pathways to Assembly reserved seating. So this document is available from the First People's Assembly of Victoria. I'll put a link as part of this video, but I'm just going to walk through it and give you some of my perspective on it. As I said, really hoping to hear other people on their perspective on it as well. So where this comes from though, just to give a bit of context before I dive into the document, is that back in June last year, there was a resolution put forward, a member-led resolution by Al Thorpe, to work out how we could ensure that as many voices as possible were heard as part of the work that the Assembly does. And just to kind of make sure to set the scene there, that the Assembly is made up of currently 31 Aboriginal people from here in Victoria. 10 of those come from the reserved seat holders, and those are the groups who already have formal recognition by the state. And the other 21 comes from the what's known as the general members, and they're the ones who are elected within their regions. So there were the different regions around the state. I was elected from the metropolitan region as one of the 9 representatives there. So we don't represent a specific group, we're just there as elected representatives on the Assembly. But so there are those 10 seats that are for the reserved members, and those 10 groups, those 10 members, they don't represent the entirety of the state. And that's really what this resolution was put forward was about, is well, how do we ensure that we do represent the whole state? And just in terms of that context there, the constitution that we have, which I'm going to try and bring across now that you can have a look at, and again this is available online on the website, the First People's Assembly Constitution, that does specify those 2 different groups, that we have got the general members who are elected and the reserved members who are part of a traditional owner group. And you can see here within the Constitution, a traditional owner group means the member of a native title holder, a registered Aboriginal party, a group who's got Traditional Owner Settlement Act recognition, or another group meeting the criteria adopted by a supermajority resolution of the Assembly Chamber. And so that's the aim of this document, is to establish that criteria D about how we can have groups who aren't previously recognised under those 3 current systems to be recognised by the First People's Assembly of Victoria to get that reserved seat. Now, sometimes within these conversations, I think there's different conversations around what that actually means. How many groups do we already represent? And so I thought I'd just tease through that briefly. So we have got the map here of all those formally recognised groups, and all those groups have registered Aboriginal party status, so it's enough to just look at the RAP map to give us a sense of that. And so those are the 11 groups that have that status here in Victoria. You might recall I said there's only 10 groups on the Assembly. That's because Yorta Yorta, this group here, have chosen not to take up that opportunity of having a seat, and that's their choice. And I'm hopeful that there are ongoing conversations to continue to encourage them to join, and that Yorta Yorta members do end up submitting a representative on the Assembly, but at the moment they don't, and that's their choice. But so we've got 10, and so these groups here, the coloured areas, they're the 10 groups that have that guaranteed seat as part of the Assembly to match up with those 21 elected members from the general pool. Now, when I look at that map, to me it looks like those 10 or 11 groups, they cover a lot of the state. I think, statistic-wise, they cover about 74% of the state, And I think also it's important to realise that some of those areas that aren't covered, so if you look around Melbourne, you look down here, around Wilson's Prom, you look in these areas here, there's no additional group who's seeking status in those areas. It's just often for those areas, it's a discussion between those groups, the existing groups around where their boundaries are. So actually I think it's more than 74% of the state has representation by those registered Aboriginal parties. And in particular, it's mainly this area here, and this area down here. That's where there is no representation. And I think we should try and address that. I think it's important that we have voices from those areas, have a seat at the table formally. But I think there's this often a misconception that because there's only 10 seats, and sometimes people talk about the 38 groups that we have here in Victoria, that there's this, could quickly just kind of do some maths and go, well, there's only 10 groups out of the 38, so there's a whole lot of, the vast majority aren't counted within that 10. But actually that 10 makes up more than that percentage. And, if you look at what's commonly referred to as the Aboriginal Languages of Victoria map, the one that was put together by the Victorian Aboriginal Corporation for Languages, that shows you kind of roughly where those 38, that idea of the 38 comes from. And many of those groups of that 38 are represented. Sometimes there's one group within the RAP that represents 5 or so of those 38. So I just think it's important to set that context again, that what we're talking about in terms of what we're trying to address through this thing, which I think is important to do, but I think it's important to realise that we're not talking about trying to address a major shortfall in who we're representing. It's trying to, importantly, fill in those gaps where we have got missing representation, formal representation on the Assembly. So that's just a bit of the context around that. And that's what we're talking about, is how do we get representation from these areas in particular. That's kind of what this conversation is about. And so this document has been put together by the Assembly based on consultation with various people, and we've sought feedback from various groups. And I think unexpectedly, there's not a lot of consensus necessarily on exactly the right way to go about this. Different groups have different perspectives on what they think should be the right way forward. But this document here spells out the proposal from the Assembly about the way forward. This is not locked in, this is just the draft, and that's why we want people's feedback. But I thought it just might be useful to spell out what this is actually talking about, so that people can provide feedback in a meaningful way. So this spells out what is the overall kind of objective of this policy, and that is that groups can be joining the First Peoples Assembly, having a reserved seat status as one of those traditional owner groups, even if they haven't got that formal recognition. So we can give them recognition as the Assembly. And some of the criteria they have to meet, this is just a summary here, we'll go through the detail in a moment, but some of the summary of the requirements to be a group recognised by the Assembly is they have to have a minimum of 80 members. So it's not just a small family group. That to me gives an indication that it's a larger group that has 80 members, and that all current day members are descendants of identified apical ancestors. They have some form of governance in place. You'll see as we move down, they don't need formal recognition. They don't have to be incorporated under ASIC, under ORIC, anything like that. They can have their own form of governance, but they need to have some form of governance they can demonstrate. And they need to demonstrate connection to a particular place, say that we are connected to this place. Unlike other forms of recognition, I think this is where there is an opportunity to have a distinct system for us, is that they don't need to have a precise geographical boundary, is what the proposal is. So they don't have to have a really fully agreed boundary between neighbours. They just have to say that we represent this area. We're not exactly sure how far to the north, to the south, or the west, but this is our core country. And so that's been identified, but they don't need those clear-cut boundaries. And importantly, that the group isn't already that area, or those groups, those families, whatever it might be, are not already represented by an existing reserve seat holder in the Assembly. So if there's a group coming forward and say, well, we fall in the area that's recognised by Eastern Mar, for example, but we want to have a seat, then they don't meet that criteria. We're only looking at those places where there is not already formal recognition. And I think that's the right way to go, because I think the groups who got that formal recognition did a lot of work to enable that to happen, and I think that it's important we respect that process and that we respect those existing groups. but that where there is no group, that's where I think this is a process to put in place. So we are seeking feedback on this. It is subject to legal review, as it says there, and we're seeking feedback from now until the 18th of February. So a bit more detail then about exactly what this looks like. Just spelling out here that the Assembly Chamber is the sole decision maker on the group's applications, and it is a supermajority resolution we would need to pass to have that group join us, which means, as you can see here, not less than 75% of all members entitled to vote on the resolution support it. So that's quite a high level of support. So of that 31, there might be some who might have to exclude themselves because they have personal connections to that group. But if everyone was able to vote, of that 31, you need 75%. And I can't do the maths for that off my head, but it's quite a high number that you can understand would need to support the inclusion of that group. There's some ideas there around confidentiality around that, which I think is important. That there is, we can seek, the Assembly can seek assistance from stakeholders in order to assist them. So it might be calling on other experts on their views around that. And that the Assembly will consult with the applicant group and interested parties, including traditional owner groups who are their neighbours, the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council as well, as part of that, to get their thoughts, because that's the group, just to clarify, the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council, they're the groups that have appointed the RAPs. The map I showed you before, those groups are all appointed by the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council. So that's one of their statutory roles, to appoint those RAPs. And we're not, through this process, trying to go around that process necessarily. We're not saying that they would be a RAP, and that's covered further down here. We're just saying that for the RAP process, often one I think the sticking points is that the groups do need to have a really clear boundary. And they do need to be formally recognised through ORIC. So they have to have that incorporation status, and they have to have a clear boundary. We've removed that threshold for what we're talking about here, which I think is reasonable based on what we're trying to do. But that's, I think, an important distinction to be aware of. But we would still be consulting with them as part of this process. So the membership of the group that would be applying, they must produce a list of their members, must have at least 80 members, which I think is a good kind of fit, maybe a little bit low, a bit high perhaps, but I think that's a good kind of starting point to have for the group size. One of the reasons why I think it has to be a reasonable number is that there has to be a form of equity as well. That all the existing RAPs who have this status, they represent a significant number of groups, a number of people, and they each have one vote on the Assembly as part of that. And so what I don't think we want is areas dividing up into much smaller groups and each of those getting one vote. That becomes disparity then. There's an inequality around that if it's not kind of almost on par. I think there's probably already some disparity, given that some of those groups that are registered do represent 5 different language groups, 5 different communities, and they only have one vote. But I think at least setting that threshold at 80 prevents further potential inequity in that regard. So they need to identify that apical ancestor. They don't need to, I think this is important here at 2.4, to provide Aboriginal identity of its members or the genealogical links. We're not wanting to put a high burden in terms of documentation around this. But there is that right to be able to just look into it further if there are concerns that the Assembly members might have around that. But it's not a requirement to have that full detail as part of the application. And that also includes around certificates of Aboriginality are not required. There's a need to define how they are going about their consultation process as a group, because that's one of the key things that we as members of the Assembly need to do, is consult with our constituents, whether that's the people who voted for us or the people who are from our registered Aboriginal party. And so they need to outline how they're going to do that, and I think that's reasonable to be able to do. And they need to outline its governance process, how they make decisions as a group. Again, it doesn't have to be formally through ORIC or ASIC, but they need to have some way of indicating how it is that they're going to be making their decisions, so that gives a level of comfort to the Assembly, and I think that's reasonable again. They need to have a connection to a particular place. That's what this is about. This is about people's connections to land, to country, across generations, and so they need to be able to show they've got a particular place they're from. They don't need that precise boundary. Again, I think that's important. They don't have to live on those places. They can be from around the state, around the country, whatever it might be, but they have to show an ongoing connection to that place in some way, shape or form, which again I think is important. They may provide documentation from other groups to support their application. So if you've got neighbours who say, yes, we think this is the right group to speak for this place, that would be really useful to have as a way of support. And those groups providing that support to that application, they don't need to have formal recognition either. So I think that's another reduction of a hurdle that might seem to be in place there. As I said earlier, they don't have to have formal recognition. They just have to demonstrate how it is that they're a group. If they do have formal incorporation, they should provide us with that, but they don't have to have formal incorporation, which I know for some groups is a sticking point in terms of some of those other processes. And so I think it's important to remove that sticking point as part of this process. They must not have representation already. As we said, they can't say, well, we're in the Eastern Mar area, but we want to put in our own submission there. I think it's right that we're just trying to address those areas where there isn't currently some form of recognition. Now, understandably, some groups might feel that they're not adequately represented, that those groups aren't representing them, and I think those are different conversations to have. I don't think we solve that by having overlap of doubling up on groups from one or another. I think that's a conversation that those community groups who might have that concern they're not represented, they need to have with their existing group to find out how they can be incorporated and their views considered. And hopefully, if that is the case, that those groups, the RAPs themselves, are reaching out to try and work out how they can be as inclusive as possible, because they have, I think, a responsibility to try and be as inclusive as possible as well. Importantly here, there's a note around that the reserve seats do not remove existing general or reserve seats. So whilst you can't just say, well, we're replacing that other group. The groups with the existing 10 or 11, if Yorta Yorta takes it up, their status is retained. Unless their status is removed from a RAP status, their status as part of the Assembly isn't affected by this process. There's some more work that needs to be done around management of conflicts. Obviously a really important thing to get right, and we know that within the Aboriginal community there can often be conflicts around these matters, so I think it is really important we get that right, but hopefully that comes in due time. In terms of approving this process, this spells out how that's going to happen, some of the timelines around that. So it needs to comply in terms of Section 9 of the Constitution, which I'm not quite sure what that is, but I'm sure you can jump on and have a look at that if that takes your interest. But there's issues around promptly replying, promptly admitting groups that do get that status, and they can then, that's once they are admitted, they need to go through a process of selecting a member to be a part of the Assembly, because each traditional owned group, they need to say, well, this is our representative for the Assembly. There's an allowance of a period of time for objections. So if there is an appointment of a group, there'll be 3 months for other groups who might object to that, to lodge that objection before it's, I think, kind of formally locked off and say, well, yeah, now they're fully accepted. And until such time that objection period has concluded, the member filling the reserve seat in question is not eligible to become a director and is not eligible to make any casting vote. So if their vote was the one that could decide if it passed or failed, they're not allowed to do that. So they're able to have a voice, they're able to engage and talk and have their views shared, but they don't necessarily have those full rights until there's that period of objection gone by. And I think that's reasonable to allow that consideration. If groups are rejected, they'll be informed by that. They'll be provided feedback on that. It won't necessarily be public. I think those are important things to be able to do. Now, I think 10 and 11 are really quite important. 10 is saying that if a group is appointed through this process by the Assembly for a particular region, and then through Native Title, through the Aboriginal Heritage Act, through the Traditional Owner Settlement Act, through any of those, a different group is appointed for that same area that's been applied to, that overrides. That will void their status as being a part of the Assembly. And that's because those pieces of legislation are the ones that we have already formally recognised. I think it's right to say that they take precedent. And so if those groups are appointed through that process, they will become the representatives for that region, and that will revoke the status of those groups who have been appointed differently. I'm sure that will be contentious and that will cause some issue. But bearing in mind what we've spoken about previously, I think that's the right way to go about things. In terms of this, I've already provided some feedback about a slight adjustment to the language here as well to ensure that it's not just if a new group is appointed under that, it's also if an existing group's area is extended to include the lands of another group that had been endorsed under our assembly process. That should also mean the revoking of that group status. So either if it's a new group is appointed as a RAP or an existing group's land area is extended, those should both revoke the status of a different group who might have had that previously. Number 11 then is talking about this idea that there are two separate processes going on here. We actually have, this treaty process we're part of at the moment, where we want to establish a framework for how treaties can be negotiated, and that framework will then be used by groups to negotiate treaty. Now, who those groups are that can actually negotiate treaty is not a decision that can only be made by the Assembly. That's a decision that will need to be made by the Assembly and government. That will need to be an agreement as part of these negotiations about which groups have that standing to have negotiated treaty. And so whilst we can accept any group as a member of the Assembly, that doesn't give them automatic rights to negotiate treaties as an individual group. And I think it is really important to understand that and to recognise that. And so this is just being really clear around that. I think it's also important to recognise and specify that our endorsement of that group as well as it not saying they're guaranteed a seat at treaty, it's also not saying that they should be the RAP. It's not saying they should have traditional owner settlement agreement status. They should have native title. It's not saying they should have special status under the Aboriginal Heritage Act. It's not saying they should have special status in welcomes. I think it should be really clear that we're only giving that status, and our authority is to only give them that status under the work of the Assembly. And it shouldn't be construed as a broader remit. It shouldn't be endorsement of them as a RAP or anything like that. We're purely saying that at the moment, we don't have anyone who represents that area. Your group seems like the appropriate group to represent that area for us, and we'd like to have you formally recognised to do that within our system. It shouldn't be seen to be an endorsement across any other systems. And lastly there's just a discussion there around dispute resolution, which I think is, again, a really important thing to be able to ensure that we have. These are contentious things that people feel really emotional about, and so we need to make sure there's a clear and transparent process around dispute resolution. So that's the draft that's out there. I encourage you to go through it in a bit more detail. I've just kind of given you an overview and some of my key thoughts around that. Now, in terms of where it goes from here, I think that what's been put forward here is pretty good, I think, in terms of a way forward. But I'm still mindful of the fact that, the registered Aboriginal party system is something that's taken to get where it is now, to cover 74% of the state, has taken since, 2006, 2007, since the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council was established. And that's been one of their main goals over that time, over that 14 years, to put those groups in place. Their goal is to try and get registered Aboriginal parties across the whole state. And they haven't been able to achieve that as yet. And so I'm hesitant to say that we as the Assembly are going to find this any easier than they have. We've got a few advantages in that we're saying they don't have to be incorporated formally, they don't have to have a distinct boundary, but I still think it's going to be a bit of a challenge to kind of come in and do that work. And so I think having this is a good process, but I'm hesitant to think that it's automatically going to mean that there's really simple and easy, quick decisions made about who are the right groups, and we all of a sudden quickly have those additional seats filled. I think it might still be some time, and there might be some challenges, and it may end up that we don't end up appointing groups under that process. But I still think it's worthwhile trying, and so I'm supportive of this process. But yeah, I think I don't think that should automatically mean that groups who aren't represented should feel like it's going to be an easy path to get representation. I still think there's going to be some challenges, and ideally, my preference would be that the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council, that through TOSA, through native title, those groups get that formal recognition, because I think there is a lot of great value in having that formal recognition. So my preference ideally would be that groups get recognised through that, and then they do get a seat here. But I do also recognise that type of system doesn't work for everybody, so hopefully this does help give a means for addressing that shortfall, which I think is important to be able to do, so that we can feel like we are, as the Assembly, as representative of as many Victorian Aboriginal groups as possible. and that is important to be able to do. So those are my views, but I'd really love to hear your views. If you've got any specific thoughts, feel free to post a message below, send me an email, give me a call. My details are out there on my website, so please don't hesitate to get in touch, have a chat. If you want me to come and talk to your community, come and talk to your family, let me know that as well. I'm happy to come out there and try and find ways to better communicate and engage. And hopefully we've got some more public-facing assembly-specific engagement coming up soon as COVID restrictions are easing. But feel free to reach out to me any way that you can. Thank you very much for watching along. I hope you found it useful. Thanks. Bullock.